walk to Nineveh, as given in ancient versions like the Septuagint, the Vulgate, Latin, and in Syriac. Yet, it is also known that in collocation with another verb, in this case, halach, to walk, kum may indicate the immediate beginning of the action. So, for example, the new JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation, go at once to Nineveh. Before choosing one of the other interpretation over the other, let us first turn to what happened next. This is the right slide, actually. Jonah is said in 1:3, Wayakom Yonah libroach Tarshisha. This sentence means Jonah got up only to flee to Tarshish, rather than Jonah started out as the new JPS to flee, no matter how attractive this rendering can be. Had the sentence read, Wayakom Yonah Wayibrach Tarshisha, that translation would have been more acceptable. Compare with 1 Samuel 21:11, Wayakom David Wayivrach Vayom Hahu Mipane Shaul. That day, David took to run away from Saul. Jonah did rise, ready to do something, but not to go to Nineveh as commanded. What was going on? Nothing is mentioned about Jonah's situation when he received the command. But we can imagine that he was in some idle position, probably sitting or even lying. If so, then the imperative kum precisely tells Jonah to get up from his sitting or lying posture. He did stand up, but he did not follow the second part of the command. Jonah obeyed the command half-heartedly. Here is a picture of Jonah's schizoid attitude toward his God, which is manifested again at the end of the story. Jonah went down to the inner part of the ship and lied down there and fall asleep. Will this be a subtle indication that Jonah returned to his initial situation before receiving the Lord's command? If so, despite his movements in chapter 1, 2-5, namely going down to Joppa, embarking a ship to go to Tarshish, he now resumed his initial passive posture. Okay, at this point, the captain of the ship ordered Jonah in verse 6, the first chapter, rise, invoke your God. There. Let us look at Jonah's situation when he received the Lord's command for the second time at 3:2. This happened in the story right after Jonah was spewed out upon the dry land by the fish that had swallowed him in 2:11. Wayika et Yonah el Hayabasha. The reader may imagine that Jonah must be sprawling out, perhaps on all four, on the ground, in any case, not in a standing position. This provides a parallel to the situation before Jonah heard the command at 1 verse 2. Jonah here was given a second chance. The commissioning of Jonah in 3:2, Kum lech el Nineveh, is the same as the previous one in 1:2. The reader may see the same ambiguity as in 1:2, that is, two possibilities of understanding the command to start going to Nineveh or to get up and start the journey. But the story goes on with the execution of the command in verse 3 of that chapter. Wayakom Yonah Wayelech el Nineveh. And Jonah rose from his lying position and walked to Nineveh, adding, Kidavar Adonai, according to the word of the Lord. I will comment on 3:6 later. Now, basically, motion verbs express the movement of some entity from one location to another. In this paper, I make free use of the cognitive approach to motion verbs, especially Leonard Tamlin's version. You see those three basic works of this scholar. Talmy labels the entity that performs the movement as figure, sometimes also called theme. And in most cases, this figure or theme coincides with the subject of the sentence. Note that figure is different from the more familiar notion agent, namely the instigator of the movement. This notion is of special importance for the causative of motion verbs. Thus, in the English, a sentence like this, the shepherd leads the herd to the pasturing field. The shepherd is the agent. The figure is the herd. The entity that performed the movement is the herd. For our purposes today, Jonah is on most occasions the figure. Motion verbs encode the following components of movements. The first two are found in all motion verbs. The other two are distributed in various ways, as we will see. Motion is the instance of movement itself. All motion verbs have this component. Path is the trajectory. For example, to walk presupposes a trajectory of walking. All motion verbs also encode this component. Ground, this technical term, is where the movement starts, as in to go out, implying a starting point, sometimes also called source, or ends, which make us think of the goal of the movement. Manner is the type of the movement. For example, the verb to flee or run away implies that the action is performed with rapid and surreptitious movement. Let us see now the verb halach, already touched upon earlier. This verb expresses motion and path, which is simply linear and continuous. See blue arrow there. In 1:2, as in 3:2, the Lord told Jonah, "Cum, lech el Nineveh." The verb needs a complement el Nineveh to Nineveh to express location where the motion should end, that is, that city, which is the ground. But it's not encoded in the lexical meaning of this verb. As we saw earlier, the executions of the command in verse 3, Vayakom Yonah vayelech el Nineveh, makes it clear that Jonah followed the command to rise and walk to Nineveh. Let us look at two other instances of halach in our story. At 1 verse 7, the passengers of the ship agreed with each other to cast lots to find out who had brought the evil, the raging storm, upon them, saying, "Go, and let us cast lots." But this literary reproduction sounds a bit awkward. The new JPS reproduces it as, "Let us cast lot." Attractive as it is, this rendering does not seem to reproduce the meaning. As mentioned above, the verb halach encodes motion and path, which suggests an ongoing movement. If this is the case, then the imperative lehu should be taken as an injunction to continue doing what is expressed in the following cohortative, Vanapila Koralot. The sortition was to be done more than once, as the plural Koralot suggests. What happened was that they kept casting lots until the culprit, Jonah, was discovered. And indeed, we are told in verse 7, the choral, singular, fell on Jonah. This ongoing situation is also found in verse 11 of the first chapter and also verse 13. Hayam holech v'so'ed. the sea was growing more and more stormy. Now we have a series of other motion verbs. The verb to come in encodes motion and path, but also the idea of a location inside which the movement ends, thus ground. The location can be directly construed with the verb as in 1:3 there, the ship Ba'a Tarshish, going to Tarshish, with the idea of harboring in Tarshish. See blue arrow entering the ground. Ground can also be indirectly but overtly indicated with the directional he, as in the second occurrence of the verb in verse 3, labo imahem Tarshisha, to go with them to Tarshish. The preposition be can also do the same job as in that example 3:4, Vayachel Jonah lavo ba'ir. He began to make his way into the city. The use of this verb with preposition el is found in the poetic part also. Watabo elecha tapilati. My prayer came to you. Now we see let us see the verb naga. It has the same meaning components as the verb to come. Examples 3:6 there. The news reached the king of Nineveh. But unlike the verb to come, it only touches the ground without entering it. See the blue arrow there. Interesting is the verb karaf, to move closer, which encodes motion, path, and ground, as in 1:6. Wayikraf elav, the captain, move closer to him, meaning Jonah. Here the complement elav overtly indicates the movement toward Jonah. That is, its ground. See arrow. The opposite of to come is to go out, of course, yatsa, which occurs in 4 verse 5. Vayetze Yonah min ha'ir. Jonah went out of the city. For Jonah, the Lord's sparing the city is a disappointment. So he left the city. As with bo, the verb yatsa encodes both motion and path as well as ground. But here it is the origin, not the end. The blue arrow departing from inside the ground there. By going out of the city, the irony is this. Jonah left behind the place where God's compassion was manifested. Now the verb abar. This is found in the poetic part. Its path passes over the ground. See the examples there? Kol misparecha v'kalecha alai avaru. All thy waves and breakers pass over me. RSV. The 5 motion verbs all have motion, path, ground, but the relation to ground is what makes them different from each other. Bo enters it, naga only touches, karab heads for it, yatsa departs from it, while abar passes over. Let us now turn to Allah, to go up. The Lord commissioning Jonah to go to Nineveh to proclaim that their wickedness has come up before me. This verb expresses motion and path whose trajectory goes upwards. See blue arrow. But the ground is not encoded. To express it, the complement lefanai, to me, is needed. It is significant that the Ninevites' wickedness is said to go up to the Lord, as if asking for judgment, rather than the Lord's judgment seeking for it. I'm reminded of Abel's blood crying to the Lord from the earth, as in Genesis 4:10. The other occurrence of Allah is in 4:6. It's about the kikayon, the tree. Waya'al me'al le Yonah. It grew over Jonah. Literally, it can up over Jonah. It can alternatively be a hifil in that text, in which case it is the Lord who made it grow over Jonah. The hifil of Allah is also found in the poetic part verse 2. Wata al mishahat hayai. And you brought my life from the pit. In any case, to express ground, the verb to go up takes a complement. The context also makes it clear that the kikayon, the tree, was to shade Jonah from the scorching sun. There is a double irony here. Jonah had left Nineveh, an exceedingly great city, whose expanse, according to verse 3, is 3 days' walk. This vast area is where God has shown his compassion. Though he left the city, Jonah still enjoyed God's kindness, but now only under the shade of a plant that would soon perish. The verb yarat, to go down, encodes both motion and path, but downward, not upward like Allah. There is something else. In chapter 1, verse 3, said of Jonah, he went down to Joppa, a location that is directly construed with the verb, which indicates that ground is encoded in the verb. See blue arrow there. By describing the journey to this location as a downward movement, produces another irony. Nineveh's wickedness goes up to the Lord asking for judgment. Jonah goes down to a lower place, running away from his task to make the Ninevites realize their wickedness. The downward path is clear also from chapter 1, verse 3. Literally, he went down and ate, meaning the pier, the ship. We understand that the pier is higher than the ship, of course. Later in chapter 1, verse 5, Jonah is said to go down to the inner place of the ship, where Yonah, Yarat, El Yarkate Hashafina. Here the ground is overtly marked by the preposition El. This usage is also found in the poetic part of the book 2:6. There, to the mountain hiddenmost parts I went down. Both Allah and Yarat encode motion and path, the former upward, the later downward, but also include the ground. The opposition between the two verbs is not symmetrical. Yarat requires the mention of the location where the movement ends. Allah does not necessarily do so. The verb barach exhibits a meaning component not yet discussed thus far, that is, manner, which is encoded in the verb together with motion and path. The rapid movement and surreptitious is part of the meaning of barach, indicated by the arrow there. The ground is marked in verse 3 with a directional ending, libroach tarshisha, to run away to Tarshish, and the prepositional phrase milipne Adonai, from the Lord's presence, also appearing in verse 10 of the same chapter. Here the man knew that he, Jonah, from the presence of the Lord, he was running away. And again in 4:2, that is why Kidamti libroach Tarshisha, I hurried down to run away to Tarshish. All four components of meaning are encoded in barach. Another motion verb that encodes all four components of motion is shuf, to return. It occurs 4 times in 3 verses 8 to 10. But here the manner consists in its going backward toward its previous stance. See blue arrow there. The ground is overtly indicated with the use of a preposition min in 3:8 to 10. The Nineveh king's words, like that, is a long quotation. The movement to a previous stance suggests that the Ninevites, this is something interesting, were at one time good people. And for some unknown reason, they ended up committing evil deeds and violence. Noteworthy is the co-occurrence of shuf in 3:9 and 10 with the mental verb nacham, to change one mind, said of God. This suggests that now this God assumes his earlier stance before the wickedness went up to him. Exegetically, probably more interesting than this analysis. Both barach and shuv encode motion, path, ground, and manner. But while barach goes in an outward path, shuv sort of retraces its previous path. In the poetic part, there are two motion verbs whose path goes around the ground, namely afaf, to wrap around, and shabav, to move around. As in chapter 2, verse 6, waters wrap around me, afafuni, the deep move around me. The last motion verb to be considered is kum. Now, except the last example here, all have been discussed at the beginning of the chapter. Like halach, the verb kum encodes motion, path, with the characteristic change from an initial posture, either lying or sitting, to the final posture, standing. See blue arrow there. Thus, in 3 verse 6, Vayakom mikiso, and he, said of the king of Nineveh, rose from his throne. That is, from a sitting position to a standing posture. Again, Jonah must have been lying on earth after being spewed out by the fish. If that is the case, then the command in 3:2, Kum lek el Nineveh, contained an injunction to stand up and walk to the city. Similarly, in 1:6, Kum kara el Elohecha, said by the captain, rise, invoke your God, is an order to Jonah to rise from his sleep and pray. To recapitulate, all motion verbs in Jonah encode motion and path. The path can be linear, halach, upward, ala, or downward. It can enter, bo, touch, these two verbs, to come near, karab, or exit, yatsa, or pass over, avar, the ground, marked by a square here. Manner appears as rapid and surreptitious path in reaching the ground, as in barach, or returning to it, shuv, or moving around it, afaf and savav. A vertical path may result in changing the initial posture, like kum there. Now, this is not in that slide, but some of you might be curious about the role of the preposition here. When the verb encodes path and ground, as in most of the verbs discussed, to come, to touch, to go down, to come near, to go out, to pass over, to flee, to move around, to wrap around, the preposition serves as overt, explicit marking of ground. When ground is not encoded, then the preposition, a preposition phrase is needed to complement the verb, like the case of halach, alach, and kum. Now, the rest of time I will be discussing the posture verbs. Let us now turn to the relatively few occurrences of posture verbs in Jonah. Shakaf, to lie, amat, to stand, yashav, to sit. These are the only posture verbs in the story of Jonah. These are also the basic posture verbs in any language. Some components of meaning that have been used to discuss the motion can also serve to describe posture verbs, especially ground and manner. A cross-linguistic study is found in the article in Newman I mentioned here at the end of this slide. Now let's see the verb amat, to stand. This indicates a posture that requires more effort to maintain itself then yashav to sit or shakav. Let us start with the lowest effort, shakav. It's found in 1 verse 5. After going down to the inner part of the ship, Jonah, it is said of it, Vayishkaf Vayiradem. He lied down and fell asleep, oblivious of what was going on until the captain of the ship found him. This posture requires no effort to maintain itself. As mentioned at the beginning of the paper, now Jonah seems to resume his earlier position before receiving the first command to get up and walk to Nineveh. Unlike kum, which is a motion verb, amat is a posture verb to be in a standing position. This posture is achieved through motion verbs. In this sense, it also means to stop doing something that has hitherto been done. This is clear from 1 verse 15. Waya'amot hayam misapo. The sea stopped raging and continued to be in this situation. By describing the sea in this way, the story suggests a great effort is required to maintain the calmness of the sea. And this is evident from the mention in verse 16 that the men in the ship feared the Lord greatly and offered sacrifice to him, and they made vows. These are the arduous effort to keep the sea calm. The verb yashav. It occurs 3 times in Jonah. First is 3:7 there. Vayeshev al-Ha'efer said of the king of Nineveh, who sat in ashes. It is tempting to understand Vayeshev here as he sat down as motion verb rather than simply he sat. But here precisely the king is said to be in a sitting position in ashes, expressing repentance for his city and its inhabitants. There is an irony here. Sitting position, especially on a throne, is a posture that reveals established authority. There is no need to make special effort to maintain it. Things are already under control. But someone in that position who leaves his or her throne only to sit down on the earth, even in ashes, is a remarkable act of humility. In the story, this is in stark contrast with Jonah, who refuses to acknowledge the fact that the Lord spared the Ninevites by leaving the city and, as we will see, only to sit under a booth and a plant that will soon die. This is mentioned in the 2 other occurrences of Yashav, as you see that in 4:5. Disappointed by the Lord's sparing the city, Jonah went out of the city, and he sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself, then sat under it in the shade, expecting that the Lord would do with the city. Here, in contrast to 3:7, both occurrences are capable of being interpreted as Jonah's posture of sitting, but also his movement to sit down. Now, how to explain this? This is an ambiguity between posture and motion. My colleague, Paola Molo, will be addressing this issue in her paper. And so I pass the baton to her. Thank you.